Hello and welcome to another Modern Horizons 3 set review. I am Paul Cheon, and today we are going to be going over the red cards. Now, before I start with this preview, I did want to say, if you've enjoyed this content and wanted to support the channel in another way, I do have a Patreon channel. The link to the Patreon is in the description below, and I do want to give a special shout out to all the current patrons. Thank you so much for your support, as it allows me to continue making all of this content. One other thing is that I did release a new tier in the Patreon, so make sure you go take a look to see everything that is offered depending on the tiers that are available. Additionally, if you wanted to follow along with my card rankings or wanted to go back and see what grades I gave all of these cards, the link to that is also in the description below. There is a Google Doc sheet link where you can basically take a look at all the different grades that I gave for all the cards in this color. And when I'm done with the entire set, then there's going to be a master sheet that has all the colors along with all the gold cards as well, where you get to basically see the full breakdown of all my card evaluations for every card in this set. But without further ado, let's dive straight into the first card that we see here on the right side, Aether Revolt. 2 red for an enchantment. Revolt. As long as a permanent you controlled left the battlefield this turn, if a source you control would deal non-combat damage to an opponent or a permanent an opponent controls, it deals that much damage plus 2 instead. Whenever you get 1 or more energy, Aether Revolt deals that much damage to any target. So let's break that down. Let's just ignore the Revolt part for the time being. This is a 4-mana enchantment, and if you are a deck that's able to generate energy, every time you do, you get to deal that much damage to something. So if you play a permanent that generates 3 energy, then you can deal 3 damage to any target. That is amazing, right? So the question then just becomes, how much energy are you going to be able to generate in kind of the average deck? This is an incredible build-around card, and that by itself is very powerful. You play this turn 4, and imagine playing against this card. You're just like, oh, if they just play 2 or 3 energy cards, then I'm just dead, right? That makes this card extremely powerful in all energy decks. Now, the other mode of this is the Revolt option, and this one's harder to pull off. You're going to have to sacrifice a permanent or rumble with opposing creatures, right, to be able to trigger this. But the way that this works is if you do get to trigger the Revolt, now, if Aether Revolt, for example, let's say you generate 2 energy to deal 2 damage to something, if you revolted, the Aether Revolt would deal 2 more damage. So that would mean that if you generated 2 energy, you can deal 4 damage to something. If you generated 3 energy, you could deal 5 damage to something. Now, I'm not entirely sure how easy it is to trigger the Revolt, but with the Aether Revolt in play, it also makes combat very difficult for your opponent because it makes it so that it's really hard to block. Because if you block, all of a sudden this gets turned on, and then if they play an energy card, then you're just going to suffer more damage as a result. But like I said, I think this is an awesome build-around card. This isn't going to go in just any deck. For example, if you're the red-green Eldrazi ramp deck, this is not going to be a card that you want. But I think in a deck that is able to generate a lot of energy, I think this card has really, really high upside. So I'm going to give this a build-around high B. But the more energy cards that you have, I can see a world where this could be an A-level card. But, I mean, you're going to need something like 8 or 9 ways to create energy. And if you do, then I think this card is pretty awesome. Additionally, by the way, the Aether Revolt, the Revolt effect also works on other non-combat damage sources. So, if a creature dies and you don't generate energy, but let's say you have a burn spell that deals 3 damage, well, the burn spell deals 5 damage instead, which is pretty relevant because there are some very, very strong red damaging effects in this format that will get this boost. Moving on, we have Amped Raptor. Oh, we are starting things off strong here. 1 in a red for a 2/1 dinosaur with first strike. When Amped Raptor enters the battlefield, you get 2 energy. That by itself is already great. 2 mana for a 2/1 first strike that generates 2 energy. Sign me up. Then, if you cast it from your hand, so if you don't reanimate it, you have to cast it from your hand, exile cards from the top of your library until you exile a non-land card. you may cast that card by paying an amount of energy equal to its mana value rather than paying its mana cost. So, let's say on turn 2 you play the Amped Raptor, and then you reveal a 2-drop. You get to play that 2-drop for free by using up to 2 energy. That is amazing, right? But also know that if you play this card specifically on turn 2, well, if you hit something big, you're just exiling that card and you're not able to actually cast the card. So there are going to be instances where if you have another thing to play on turn 2, oftentimes you're going to want to play that, and you're going to want to play the Amped Raptor after you play another card that generates energy. Let's say you play a Conduit Goblin or something like that, where you have 2 energy on turn 2, and then on turn 3 you play the Amped Raptor, and that makes it far more likely for you to be able to cast a spell on turn 3, which effectively turns the Amped Raptor into a Bloodbraid Elf in a lot of instances. So this card is amazing. Like I said before, 2 mana for a 2/1 first striker that generates 2 energy is already a very, very good card. That's a high C level card by itself. Maybe even a low B, but with this ability to play things for free, potentially, if you have more energy, makes this at least a B, or potentially moving it up to a high B. Amped Raptor, very, very solid creature. Next, we have Ashling Flame Dancer. 2 red for a 4/4 legendary elemental shaman. You don't lose unspent red mana as steps and phases end. So what that means is you can just tap your mountains and red sources for mana if you have nothing else to do with it, and then on the following turn you get to use that red mana doesn't empty out at the end of your turn, and you can use it to cast, for example, a large Eldrazi. Magecraft. Whenever you cast or copy an instant or sorcery spell, discard a card, then draw a card. If this is the second time this ability has resolved this turn, Ashling Flame Dancer deals 2 damage to each opponent and each creature they control. If it's the third time, add 4 red. Okay, so now we understand why that you don't lose unspent red mana as steps and phases end exists. Because it works really well with the other abilities that Ashling has. So let's say you play the Ashling on turn 4, turn 5, let's say you're playing a 2-color deck, you float 3 red mana. Then on turn 6, you can set up for a huge turn. Because you have the 3 floating red mana, you can then potentially chain off 2 or 3 spells here, right? To rummage 3 times, deal 2 damage to everything, and then also get the 4 red mana back, which you can then bank again, because if Ashling is in play, then that 4 red mana still stays in your pool. So that's a pretty cool effect. How good is this card? Well, it's a 4 mana 4/4, which is fine. Double red makes it a little bit harder to cast, but the ability of just Magecraft, when you cast a spell, you get to rummage, is a pretty solid ability, right? Oh, excuse me. That only happens for the first mode. For the second mode, you only deal 2 damage to all things your opponents control, and then for the third mode, you add 4 red. Now, one thing that I've noticed, at least in other sets, is just the 2 damage to everything mode hasn't been as amazing, but this is one-sided. So that's what makes this nice, right? It's not too hard to be able to play this on turn 4, and then set this up where on turn 5, you get to play 2 spells. And what does that mean? You get to rummage and deal 2 damage to everything your opponents control. It's going to be pretty hard to cast a third spell unless you floated the mana. But I think this card just gives you enough value. I don't think this card is quite good enough to be an A-level card because it requires some setup, and it's not always going to be awesome, right? The 2 damage to everything is not always going to be great. And then doing it a third time, giving you 4 red, just feels a little underwhelming. It feels like, hey, I got to cast 3 spells in a turn. I feel like I want more than just add 4 red mana. So for that reason, I think Ashling is a very solid creature with nice abilities. I'm going to give her a B. So starting things off strong here with red, with 3 B cards in a row. Next, we have Cursed Mirror. 2 in a red for an artifact. It's a rare. Tap to add 1 red mana. As Cursed Mirror enters the battlefield, you may have it become a copy of any creature on the battlefield until end of turn, except it has haste. So this is just kind of a one-shot, right? You may have it become a copy of any creature. So it's almost like a threaten, but basically it's a clone, but it only lasts for 1 turn, and then it's just a 3 mana artifact that taps for 1 red. I just don't think that's very good. I mean, this is basically a manalith, but it's a manalith that's specifically red. It doesn't fix your mana, and you can hit your opponent 1 time. Oftentimes, you're going to want to play this on turn 3, and when you play it on turn 3, you're not going to be copying anything great anyways. And then in the late game, I suppose every now and then you can get lucky and copy an opponent's Eldrazi, and then hit them for a turn. So there are instances where that can be okay, but I feel like just on average, this is just kind of underwhelming. I'm going to give Cursed Mirror a D with a potential sideboard C if you're playing against a deck. Let's say your opponent has like a Kozilek or an Emrakul or something like that. Maybe you hold this in your hand to get some kind of an effect there. Next, we have Detective's Phoenix. 2 and a red for a 2/2 enchantment creature Phoenix. It's got Bestow, red, collect evidence 6. Now, this is an effect from a couple of sets ago from Murders at Karlov Manov. To pay this Bestow cost, pay red and exile cards with total mana value 6 or greater from your graveyard. That is not a trivial amount. 6 is a lot, especially because this set's not necessarily looking to turbo mill itself. It's got flying and haste, and then enchanted creature gets +2/+2 and has flying and haste. You may cast Detective's Phoenix from your graveyard using its Bestow ability. So, in general, is this card going to be play out? Well, I think in a lot of instances, early on, this is going to be a 3-mana 2/2 flying haste. That's a really just solid creature, not absurd, but it's a solid beater. But in the late game, if that 3-mana 2/2 flying haster has been dealt with, then if this is in your graveyard, you can then cast this from your graveyard to bestow a creature and give it +2/+2 flying and haste. And then if that creature dies, the Detective's Phoenix still stays on the battlefield as a 2/2 flying haster. So this is just kind of an awesome way to deal damage early, and then in the late game, also just kind of make sure that you just always have a good flying threat in play. So how good does that make the Detective's Phoenix? I don't think this is a game-breaking type card. I think it's a very, very solid creature and something that you're happy to have in all of your red decks. So for that reason, because this card doesn't necessarily help you when you're behind either, I'm going to give Detective's Phoenix a high B. Could see a world where it's a low A, but I'll give it a high B for now. Moving on, we have Eldrazi Linebreaker. 1 colorless mana and a red, so you do need to find colorless mana to cast this. This is a 3/3 Eldrazi creature with trample. At the beginning of combat on your turn, target creature you control gains haste and gets +X+0 until end of turn, where X is the number of Eldrazi you control. That is a really, really powerful ability. So this by itself, if you are able to cast it on turn 3, and that's a big if, because of course this requires colorless mana, but I'm just assuming that you are playing a color combination where you're playing, for example, an Eldrazi deck, where that's not going to be too bad. If you play this on turn 3, this is a 3-mana 4/3 trample haste creature at the very minimum, right? With the potential for more. This is kind of like a Reckless Stormbreaker or Stormseeker, I'm not sure. But the thing is, it has the potential for a lot more. Imagine a red-green deck, right? A red-green Eldrazi deck that has no shortage of the ability to make Scions. I mean, this thing can give something +4/+0 in trample and haste, right? Oh, excuse me, not trample. +4/+0 and haste. That is incredible. All in a nice, already solid body. So I'm going to say this. Eldrazi Linebreaker is a card that if you can cast it, which traditionally are going to be the Eldrazi decks, is going to be... I'm going to give this a low A. I think this thing is an absolute beatdown of a card, right? Not only that, if you have, for example, a board with a bunch of Scions in play, let's say you're red-green with a bunch of Scions in play, you can just start pumping your Scions, right? You can just be like, all right, I got a 5/1 Scion, attack you. And now you're starting to trade off your Scions for real cards. Not to mention, if you play a big Eldrazi and you give that thing haste, that's also close to game over as well. So I just think this is efficiently statted enough where this is probably like a low A in most Eldrazi decks. Now remember, it's a colorless card. Don't just put this in any red deck. If you're like, for example, a red-black affinity deck, it's going to be a lot harder to be able to cast this card. So think of this as more of just kind of a gold card almost, where it only really goes in the Eldrazi decks. Next, we have Fanged Flames. 1 and a red sorcery, devoid. Fanged Flames deals 4 damage to target creature or planeswalker. If that creature or planeswalker would die this turn, exile it instead. So this is a devoid lava coil. 2 mana to deal 4 damage to anything. unconditional at common, that's how you know this set's going to be a little bit juiced, because you don't see that very often. For 2 mana, you usually get 3 damage in most limited environments, but Fang Flames is very, very strong. Very solid removal spell in this format. I'm going to give Fang Flames a high C, likely going to be one of the best removal spells in the format. Moving on, we have a Flare of Duplication. 1 red for an instant. You may sack a non-token red creature rather than pay the spell's mana cost. Copy target instant or sorcery spell. You may choose new targets for the copy. Just historically, I've never been a fan of this type of effect, Fork. It's a 3 mana Fork. The fact that you can play it for free is cool, but it's not really free, right? You're sacrificing a creature. You're sacrificing a creature to be able to fork a spell. Now, if it's a really powerful spell, sure, there are instances where this card can be good, but there are also enough instances where you just can't cast this card, or it doesn't do anything. And I've just never, ever, ever been impressed by effects like this. So I am happy if I'm proven wrong here, but I'm going to start Flare of Duplication here with a D. Moving on, we have Fledgling Dragon. This is an old reprint back in original OTJ. This was a Judgment card, I believe. 2 red for a 2/2 flyer. It's a dragon. It's got Threshold. As long as 7 or more cards are in your graveyard, Fledgling Dragon gets +3/+3 and has red. Fledgling Dragon gets +1/+0 until end of turn. What does that mean? That means if you have 7 or more cards in your graveyard, your 4 mana 2/2 flyer becomes a Shivan Dragon. Becomes a 5/5 dragon with fire breathing. How good is that? Well, it really just depends on how easy it is for you to get Threshold. Back in OTJ, it was pretty trivial, right? You just had lots of ways to discard, lots of ways to fuel your graveyard. So it really depends on the color combinations, I'm going to say. For example, if you're a red-white deck, I can't imagine you're going to be able to get Threshold very easily. But let's say you're a red-green deck. I believe green has the... There was a 2 mana common that lets you look at the top 4 cards of your library. You pick a permanent, you put that into your hand and the rest into your graveyard. If you have effects like that, all of a sudden Fledgling Dragon becomes amazing. So depending on the color that you are, this card can go from something like a D level card or even maybe a low C, where you don't get Threshold very often, to a B level card, right? Where in the right circumstances, you can have this be a card with Threshold. So I'm going to actually modify my grade here. I'm going to go C, build around B, where in the right deck that can get Threshold pretty easily, I think this can be a B level card. But I think in most instances, a 4 mana 2/2 flyer is just really, really weak. And if that's going to be the card that this is going to be about 90% of the time or 80% of the time, that's really bad. That's a D level card. So we'll go C/B here if you can get a Threshold pretty easily. Moving on, we have Frogmere Enforcer, 7 mana for a 4/4 Frogmere. It's got Prototype. For 3 and a red for a 2/2, you may cast a spell with this different mana cost, color, and size. It keeps its abilities and types. Also, it's got affinity for artifacts. So this is a Mirror Enforcer and a Frogmite combined in one, and you have the option here of being able to play it as a Frogmite or a Mirror Enforcer, but not quite, because Frogmite was 4 colorless and this is 3 colorless and a red. So if you want to play this as a 2/2, it won't be free. You can play this for a red mana for a 2/2 in the artifact deck. Now, of course, this is strictly a card for a deck that has a lot of artifacts. Is the red-black combination is definitely the one where you're really looking to have affinity. But I can see, for example, some other color combinations where you just end up with a lot of artifacts and have this card be okay. But this is not a set with artifact lands, right? This is not a set with a bunch of 1-mana artifacts as well. So affinity for artifacts is not as strong in this format as it was in Mirrodin Block, where in Mirrodin Block, if something said affinity on it, you just took it and you figured it out because that's how powerful it was. I just don't see that being the case here. So I'm going to give Frogmere Enforcer a C if you have an artifact deck. I think even in an artifact deck, this card is just okay. All right, moving on, we have Furnace Hellkite. Now, this is a bit of a better payoff, I'm going to say. 5 colorless, red for a 5/5 dragon artifact creature. This also has affinity for artifacts. It's got flying and fire breathing. Red Furnace Hellkite gets +1/+0 until end of turn. So this is literally a Shivan dragon for 7 mana, but it's got affinity for artifacts. And this is such a better payoff card than the previous one, right? Look at this one also costs 7 mana. And if you get a discount, let's say there's realistically, let's say there's 3 artifacts in play because you really drafted around it. This is a 4 mana 4/4. Let's say there are 3 artifacts in play. This is a 4 mana 5/5 flying fire breather. Furnace Hellkite is amazing. And also, you don't even need a ton of artifacts. Even if you have 2 artifacts in play, we're talking about a 5 mana 5/5 flyer with fire breathing. That's also really, really solid. I don't think you will have 3 artifacts all the time, but I think Furnace Hellkite is at least a B, and certainly could see a world where if you play this consistently as a 4 mana 5/5 flyer, then we're getting close to A level status. Furnace Hellkite is very, very strong. Moving on, we have what I believe will be the best red common in the set here in Galvanic Discharge. This card is amazing. 1 red, instant. Choose target creature or planeswalker. You get 3 energy. 1 mana, get 3 energy. Then you may pay any amount of energy. Galvanic Discharge deals that much damage to that permanent. Oh my gosh. Red instant, you can deal 3 damage to anything that you want. If you have more energy, you can deal 4, 5, 6, 7 damage, right? So this can be a 1 mana Doomblade. It can kill anything. And if you kill something small, well, you also have energy left over, right? Let's say you kill a 2/2. You still have 1 energy left over. This thing is ridiculous for 1 mana. This card is amazing. And this is one of the few commons in the set that I will give a B. Maybe it's a low B. But this is likely going to be one of the best commons in the set. Galvanic Discharge is incredible. Moving on, we have another really good removal spell in Ghostfire Slice. 2 and a red for an instant uncommon, Devoid. This spell costs 2 less to cast if an opponent controls a multicolor permanent. Ghostfire Slice deals 4 damage to any target. Alright, so 2 and a red. 4 damage to any target. Remember Char? Char dealt 2 damage to you, and it was still a fine card. This is just straight up 2 mana, 4 damage to anything. Even your opponent's dome, right? Also, there's a bunch of gold commons in this format. There's a bunch of gold cards. A good amount of the time, there's going to be a gold permanent, a multicolored permanent in play. And what does that mean? That means this thing costs 1 mana to deal 4 damage to anything. Let's say this thing costs 1 mana in a third of your games. That is amazing. For a card that's already really solid. Ghostfire Slice also gets an easy B here from me. Moving on, we have Glimpse the Impossible. 2 and a red for a sorcery. Exile the top 3 cards of your library. You may play those cards this turn. At the beginning of the next end step, if any of those cards remain exiled, put them into your graveyard. Then create a 0/1 colorless Eldrazi spawn token for each card put into your graveyard this way. These tokens have sacrificed this creature, add colorless mana. Now, let's say you cast no spells. What does that mean? This is 2 and a red. It's almost like a seething song. It's 2 and a red, make 3 0/1 Eldrazi tokens, right? That's not the most powerful thing, but let's say you are the red-green Eldrazi ramp deck and you have a bunch of 7, 8, 9 mana cards. Yeah, you can just still play this card, right? You can just play this as a way to just kind of turbocharge your way to casting a Breaker of Creation, of casting an Ulamog or a Kozilek. So when you have cards like that, this card can just be a totally fine card. Also, if you play this late in the game, let's say you're playing a ramp strategy and you play this turn 6 or turn 7, right? Oftentimes this is going to draw you a card. Let's say turn 6, you play this, right? You have 5 lands in play, you play this. You hit a land, a 3-drop, and whatever. Then on turn 6, you get to play your land, play your 3-drop, and you get a Scion or a Spawn. That's pretty solid. So I think this card is a lot better than I think you would expect when you first read this card. When you play it exactly on turn 3, you're obviously not going to play anything. And so when you play a turn 3, you have to think of it as kind of just a way to make a bunch of 0/1 spawn tokens, which is okay. But then this card just scales really well into the late game. So I do think this card has a home. I think specifically this is a card that you want in your Eldrazi ramp deck. So in a kind of a teamer deck is kind of where you want to play this card. I don't think it's very good outside of that. But in the teamer deck, I would give the Glimpse the Impossible a C, and let's give it a D everywhere else. So we'll give it a D, and then a build around C in the Eldrazi ramp decks. All right, moving on. We have, all right, you're going to see Heragast Erupting Nullkite, and you're going to go, well, Paul, this is a colorless card. Well, it's got an emerge cost of red, so you're going to see this with the other Eldrazi in the set. If they have an emerge cost or a prototype cost or anything like that that requires colored mana, it's going to go in the colored mana of that space. I am fully aware that you can cast this for 9 colorless mana, but that's what I'm choosing to do, and so deal with it. All right, 9 mana for a 6/6 legendary Eldrazi dragon. Emerge 6 red. You may cast a spell by sacrificing a creature and paying the emerge cost reduced by that creature's mana value. So let's say you have a 3 mana artifact creature in play. If you sacrifice this emerge cost of 8 gets reduced by 3, right? Then you can play this for 5 mana, and then you get a 6/6 flyer that has this ability. When you cast a spell, you may exile your hand. If you do, draw 3 cards. It's got flying. Each creature spell you cast has emerged. The emerge cost is equal to its mana cost, which means any other card that you want to cast out of your hand, they have emerge, and you can sack other things that you have to be able to play those big things as well for cheap. So let's say you have another big Eldrazi in your hand and you emerge the Heragast. If you have anything else laying around, you can sacrifice those creatures to pay for the emerge cost of one of the other big things in your hand. So this thing is just awesome. This thing just has a lot of greatness attached to this. If you emerge this early, you are casting a 6/6 flyer early, ahead of schedule. If you have a 3-drop in play, then on turn 5, you can get a 6/6 flyer. By turn 5, you're going to probably have 2 or 3 cards in your hand. You can discard those and then draw a full new hand. And then you have a 6/6 flyer in play that also makes all your other things in your hand have emerge. If you play this as the last card in your hand, well, guess what? You get to draw 3 cards, right? You get to draw 3 cards. And again, you can just completely ignore the fact that this costs 9, and this is often just going to cost you 5 or 6 mana. So this card is just excellent. This card is just excellent, especially if you're red. If you're not red, it's fine. If you're not red, this is also still just fine. Like, if you have an Eldrazi ramp deck and you just play this for 9 mana, like, you get a 6/6 flyer, presumably for 9. If you play this for 9, it'll be the last card in your hand, and it's still a 6/6 flyer that draws you 3 cards. It's basically, I mean, we're going to see it later on down the line. It's going to be kind of like a null drifter. So that's also good. But the fact that you can emerge this, if you emerge this and you're red, I mean, Heragast is just an A. It's just such great stats, and you just get so much value, right? You just play this 6 mana, 6/6 flyer, draw 3. Yeah, sign me up. You play this as a 4 mana or a 5 mana 6/6 flyer that lets you rummage and discard 2 cards and draw 3 cards. That's also really good. Heragast is an absolute beatdown of a card, and Emerge is a really, really powerful effect. Emerge was extremely powerful in I forget the name of the set that it was in, but it was very, very powerful in that set, and Heragast here is no exception. All right, moving on, we have Infernal Captor. Okay, gonna slightly tick down the power level here. 3 in a red for a 3/3 Devil Rogue with Exploit. When this creature enters the battlefield, you may sacrifice a creature, including itself if you want. When Infernal Captor exploits a creature, gain control of target artifact or creature until end of turn. Untap that permanent, it gains haste until end of turn. So it's a 4 mana 3/3. If you sack a Scion or anything else, or even itself, you can threaten, which is pretty nice, especially in this format because you could potentially threaten Eldrazi, which is pretty cool. And also, there are plenty of cards in this format. A lot of the black cards allow you to sacrifice things, so you can actually play the Infernal Captor, sack something to steal something, and then once you steal the card, you can steal that as well. So I feel like this is I feel like in decks where you can sacrifice the creature that you steal, this card gets pretty solid. But this is never really something that you're going to be taking that highly, right? So I think Infernal Captor is probably kind of like a D-level card, but in kind of the right deck, it can go up to a C level, right? But you know what? I'm just going to have it at D. I think hey, look, you're going to have some cards that are not awesome. And Infernal Captor is certainly a card. Even in the decks that's looking to steal things, you're going to get this on the wheel a lot. All right, moving on. We have Inventor's Axe. Red for an artifact equipment with flash. When Inventor's Axe enters the battlefield, you get 2 energy. All right, so it's an equipment that gets you 2 energy. When Inventor's Axe enters the battlefield, attach it to target creature you control. Equip creature gets +2/+0. Equip, pay 2 energy. Okay. I mean, you're getting 2 energy right away. And then you're also basically able to use this as kind of like a bone splitter type card, but you can use it as kind of like a combat trick. Now, how good is this combat trick? Well, not insane, right? Oftentimes, this is not going to let you win combat. It's going to let you trade your creature with what they have. And then if you want to equip something else, you're going to have to pay the 2 energy. So it gives you something to do with that energy. So at the very least, what this means is this card allows you to trade up one of your smaller creatures with something that your opponent might have, or just get in for some extra damage. And then once that trade has happened, you can still at least move it once by itself, right? Additionally, red is the affinity colors. So if you're playing affinity, and that's the really difficult thing about this format with grading cards, because these cards just only really get good in certain archetypes. Like, for example, do you really want to play this in your red-green Eldrazi ramp deck? I don't think so. But in a red-white aggressive energy deck that has a little bit of artifact synergies, and even a red-black deck that has artifact synergies that wants you to play cheap artifacts, right? For some of the affinity payoff cards. Yeah, I can see this being a player in those decks. So again, I'm going to give this card a C, but a C in kind of decks that could utilize the energy or have an interest in having cheap artifacts. I would not put this in any just typical run-of-the-mill red-green Eldrazi ramp type deck, because I think in that deck, there's just not as much that you're going to want to do with the energy necessarily, or the fact that there's an artifact in play. But if I'm red-black, yeah, I'll absolutely play Inventor's Axe. Next we have, Lelia the Blade Reforged. This is a powerhouse in cube, so I bet it's going to be a powerhouse in limited here. 2 in a red for a 2/2 legendary spirit warrior with haste. When Lelia the Blade Reforged attacks, exile the top card of your library. You may play that card this turn. Sign me up. Whenever one or more cards are put into exile from your library and or your graveyard, put a +1/+1 counter on Lelia. So, of course, there are those instances where you're going to be exiling cards from your graveyard or from the top of your library in other ways. But by itself, it's a 3-mana 2/2 haste. When you attack, it becomes a 3/3 immediately, and then you can start just playing cards off the top of your library. This card is incredible. It's in just an absolute powerhouse of a card, especially if you have it turn 3 on the play. You're looking at a 3-mana 3/3 haster that continues to grow. If you can find a way to connect or attack more than once, I mean, this card is just so savage. Lelia is a card, it's a 3-mana 3/3 haster that grows and draws you cards. I'm going to give her an A. Next, we have Meltdown, red, X, sorcery. Destroy each artifact with mana value X or less. I'm going to give this a D, but it's a sideboard B. If you're playing against red-black, this card is absolutely broken, absolutely busted, but certainly not necessarily something that you're going to be wanting to main deck. But when you board it in, it is an absolute house against red-black, so D, sideboard B. Next, we have Meteoric Mace. 4 red for an artifact equipment. Equip creature gets +4/+0 and has trample. Equip cost of 4 colorless. It's got Cascade. I was kind of hoping for a little bit more. This is really expensive. You play this for 6 mana and you get to Cascade into a cheaper card. It could be anything, right? You're not necessarily guaranteed to get a 5-drop or a 4-drop. You can hit a 2-drop, right? So on average, you're going to hit like a 3-mana card. And then it has an equip cost of 4. So you're paying 10 mana to get +4/+0 and trample with Cascade. Now, Cascade is really what saves this card, just because it's always a 2-for-1, even though it comes in at the hands of a very inefficient equipment. But it's still a Cascade card. It still gets you something with a very expensive equip cost that could potentially win you the game in the very late game. But I don't think this card's particularly strong. I'm going to give it a C just because it has Cascade, but I don't think this card comes close to, for example, the Allosaur that we had in green, which is a high B, borderline low A level card. Next, we have Mog Mob. It's like a triple Mog Fanatic. I mean, that's the joke here at least. Red for a 3/3 Goblin. Sacrifice Mog Mob. It deals 3 damage divided as you choose among 1, 2, or 3 targets. So it's a red 3/3 that when you sacrifice it, you can basically cast Arc Lightning. How good is this card? It's a very good card, right? But the mana cost of this is really what holds it back. Triple red is just really difficult. So you're going to need like a 10 or 11 red source mana base to be able to pull this off. So if this was 2 colorless and a red with this ability, yeah, this card would be very strong. It would be like a high B level card. But given the triple red mana cost of this card, I think it's still something that you probably want to play. You have to skew your mana base still to be able to play it. But if you can, I would give this a C level card. Again, because in most instances, you're going to be playing this on turn 5, turn 4. Damage doesn't go on the stack, so you can't block, sack, and then deal 3 damage as you choose. So, you're kind of paying for a really hard to cast Arc Lightning. Actually, the more I think about this, I'm just like, it's kind of going down and down in my rankings. But the fact that this is a creature is pretty nice, because what that means is you can play this as an Arc Lightning, and then there's multiple ways in other colors to get creatures or permanents back from your graveyard. We saw the Evolution Witness, or the Eternal Witness green common, that can get a permanent, right? So when this is in your graveyard, you can get it back. And then there's going to be black ways to recur creatures from the graveyard as well. And for that reason, I will give Mog Mob a C. Next, we have Molten Gatekeeper, 2 and a red for a 2/3 artifact creature golem. Whenever another creature enters the battlefield under your control, Molten Gatekeeper deals 1 damage to each opponent. Unearth for a red. I mean, it's an artifact, but it's a 3 mana 2/3. That's the terrible stats. It can deal some damage to your opponents. I'm not the biggest fan of Molten Gatekeeper. I would avoid playing this card in general. I just don't think you're not getting... Wow, Okay, I just don't think you're getting enough bang for your buck here on Molten Gatekeeper because the body is so bad. I am going to give this a D. Next, we have Party Thrasher, 1 and a red for a 1/4 Lizard Wizard. It is a rare. I think they just wanted to make a Lizard Wizard. That's going to be my guess. Anyways, non-creature spells you cast from exile have Convoke. That means each creature you tap while casting a non-creature spell from exile pays for 1 colorless or 1 mana of that creature's color. So it just makes your spells cheaper. All your creatures basically become creatures that can tap for colorless mana. So that's pretty nice, right? That is definitely very, very nice. So that alone is a pretty nifty ability. But at the beginning of your pre-combat main phase, you may discard a card. If you do, exile the top 2 cards of your library, then choose one of them. You may play that card this turn. That's just a good ability, right? It's better than Rummage. Now, the turn you play it, you don't get this ability, right? The turn that you play it, this will happen on your next turn because it happens at the pre-combat main phase, so your first main phase. So on your next main phase, you draw your card for your turn, you pitch a card, and then you get to cast the best card, or play rather, not cast. So you can play lands off of this. You can play the best card of your top 2 cards of your library. That is really, really solid, right? This is not just a Rummager. It's better than that because you have the choice of 2 cards. Not to mention, this is a really hard to kill creature, meaning that this effect is just going to happen a lot. And then also the fact that this gives your spells Convoke is also really, really nice. Now, the spells that the non-creature spells with Convoke, you can only cast from exile, meaning effects like this or other ways that exile spells that you can cast. So I think Party Thrasher is an excellent creature. I'm going to give this a B. Moving on, we have Phyrexian Ironworks, 2 and a red for an artifact. Whenever you attack, you get an energy. Pay 3 energy. Create a 3/3 colorless artifact golem creature token. Activate only as a sorcery. So this by itself doesn't generate you energy right away. And if I'm reading this carefully, it says whenever you attack, you get an energy. And comments, correct me if I'm wrong. I believe that means even when you attack with a bunch of creatures, I believe you only get 1 energy, right? I believe you only get 1 energy. So what that means is most of the time, this is going to be something that you use to channel other energy you have laying around and making artifact tokens. Now, if you have a deck that's cares about energy and also cares about artifacts, right? That's nice. It's a 3 mana artifact that generates an artifact, which does help with affinity. And then and those decks tend to be aggressively slanted, so this also generates you some energy there as well. So I think Phyrexian Ironworks definitely has a home, specifically in energy decks and artifact decks. They kind of go hand in hand. I'll give Phyrexian Ironworks a C. You know, like there are decks where this card just doesn't do that much, right? The thing is, you're going to have to be able to make at least one golem here to have this card be good. And if you make two, then that's pretty solid. But I mean, you're kind of going through hoops to make some golem tokens or only generating one energy a turn. Now, if I misread this, and if you attack with a bunch of things and you get a bunch of energy, I take it back. This card goes up. If that's the case, then I'll give this a high C. And if not, I'll give this a C. Maybe a low C. Next, we have Power Balance. This is a play on Counterbalance. Red for an enchantment. Whenever an opponent casts a spell, you may reveal the top card of your library. If you do, you may cast that card without paying its mana cost if the two spells have the same mana value. There is just far too much randomness to this. I think this card works when you have a way to manipulate the top of your deck with a card like Sensei's Divining Top, for example. But I think in just a normal game of limited magic, this is just too random. It's gonna miss way too often. I think Power Balance is an F. Somebody's gonna play this against me. Somebody's gonna beat me with it. I'm gonna be sad. I'm still giving it an F. Moving on, we have Ral and the Implicit Maze. 3 red for a Saga. Chapter 1, Ral and Implicit Mage deals 2 damage to each creature and planeswalker your opponent controls. Chapter 2, you may discard a card. If you do, exile the top 2 cards of your library. You may play them until the end of your next turn. That's very important. You can play both of them, right? You don't just choose one. Unlike the Lizard Wizard from before, you can play both of them. And until the end of your next turn. So you have... this card, that's just good value there. Then, Chapter 3, create a Spellgorger Weird token. It's a 2 and a red 2/2 weird creature token with, whenever you cast a non-creature spell, put a +1/+1 counter on Spellgorger Weird. So you're getting a lot of value here, right? Now, 5 mana to deal 2 damage to everything is just not the most powerful thing in the world. But remember, this only targets your opponent's creatures, which is nice. You can still clear 1 or 2 creatures, maybe a couple of scions. Then you get to basically discard a card to draw 2 cards. Then you get a creature on top of that. That's just a lot of value. Now, I don't think this card is completely busted. This is no Fable of the Mirror Breaker, but it is very, very solid. I'm going to play this in all of my red decks. I'm going to give Ral and the Implicit Maze a B just on sheer value. Next, we have Ral, Monsoon Mage. 1 and a red for a 1/3 legendary human wizard. Instant and sorcery spells you cast cost 1 less to cast. It's kind of like a Baral. Rawl? Is there something there? Whenever you cast an instant or sorcery spell during your turn, flip a coin. If you lose the flip, Ral, Monsoon Mage deals 1 damage to you. If you win the flip, you may exile Ral. If you do, return him to the battlefield transformed under his owner's control. Oh my gosh, can you imagine how sad you're going to be if you just keep losing flips here and taking a bunch of damage? But a 2 mana 1/3 Goblin Electromancer effect is just fine, especially if you're just looking to cast a lot of spells. And if you win the coin flip, it's a 50-50 shot. But like I said, a 2 mana 1/3 that makes your things cheaper is already kind of just... Probably, like if you have a lot of spells, that's like a C-level spell. But the fact that half the time this flips over and gives you this, let's take a look. Ral, Leyline Prodigy, Legendary Planeswalker Ral. Ral enters the battlefield with an additional loyalty counter on him for each instant and sorcery spell you've cast this turn. So oftentimes it's going to be like 1, right? Let's just say this comes into play with 3 loyalty. +1 until your next turn, instant and sorcery spells you cast cost 1 less to cast. -2, Ral deals 2 damage divided as you choose among 1 or 2 targets. Ral, draw a card if you control a blue permanent other than Ral. -8, exile the top 8 cards of your library. You may cast instant and sorcery spells from among them this turn without paying their mana cost. So let's just assume that this -8 will just never be used. But what that means is, with this card, is you can either tick this up to get the Electromancer effect. So let's say this is 3, then you tick it up to 4. Or, let's say this is on 3, then you can immediately electrolyze. You can, or Forked Bolt, however you want to do it. You can deal 2 damage divided as you choose, right? And then if you have a blue permanent, you draw a card. That's great. That's a really, really solid card. And the thing is, the cost of playing this card is so low, right? It's a 2-drop. It's a 2-mana 1/3 that makes your spells cheaper. So as early as turn 3, right? Let's say you play the Lava Coil card, the 1 in a red, deal 4 damage, right? You still have 2 mana available. You flip this over, and then with the 2 mana available, let's say you play your blue creature, right? A 2-mana blue creature. Then all of a sudden you get to electrolyze and you have a blue creature in play, and then you can still tick this up to make your spells cheaper. Now, I'm not sure how well supported a blue-red spells deck is, but this card seems awesome if that is what the blue-red deck's trying to do, and it has a lot of spells. So I can't see going lower than a B on Rel. I think Rel is going to be very, very solid and something that's going to be pretty fun to play with. Moving on, we have Reckless Pyro Surfer. 1 in a red for a 2/2 haste human scout. Landfall. Whenever land enters the battlefield under your control, Reckless Pyro Surfer gains Battle Cry until end of turn. That means whenever this creature attacks, each other attacking creature gets +1/+0 until end of turn. Each instance of Battle Cry triggers separately. So, you can play this on turn 2, but oftentimes what you can also do is, for example, let's say you play this turn 3. Like you have a 2-drop and then you play this turn 3, then you play a land. Then this is a 2/2 haster with Battle Cry. Let's say you play this turn 4 or 5, right? And you play a land. And let's say that land is one of the cycle of the fetch lands, right? The cycle fetch lands. Then all of a sudden you get double Battle Cry, which is really, really nice. So for a 2-mana 2/2 haster that gives you Battle Cry, that's just really, really strong. So this is obviously a card that's just going to be great in any aggressive deck. I would just be very, very happy to play this. So I like the Reckless Pyro Surfer enough. I don't think it's completely absurd. I think it's just a very, very good card. I'll give Reckless Pyro Surfer a high C. Particularly in this format where removal is just also going to be better. It's pretty easy to remove this. All right, moving on, we have Reiterating Bolt. 1 in a red for a sorcery with Replicate, pay 3 energy. When you cast this spell, copy it for each time you pay the replicate cost. You may choose new targets for the object, for the copies. Reiterating Bolt deals 3 damage to target creature or planeswalker. So, ignore the replicate entirely. This is 1 in a red to deal 3 damage to a creature or planeswalker. That's already a very solid removal spell. You're never cutting it, and you're going to take it relatively highly. Now, obviously, that's worse than the Lava Coil that exists, but red is a color that is interested in energy. And if you can replicate this, this is one of the best ways to utilize energy, right? This is amazing. If you have 3 energy lying around, you can deal 3 damage to 2 things? That's absurd. For 2 mana, you get to kill 2 things. If you have 6 energy, now, granted, getting 6 energy is not going to be easy. I just think in a lot of instances, you're going to be able to copy this and kill 2 things for 2 mana and 3 energy. That makes this really, really solid. So, Reiterating Bolt by itself is a C-level removal spell, very solid. But the fact that you can replicate this and kill 2 things, and if you do, it's just such a blowout, Reiterating Bolt gets a B from me. Next, we have Sarpedian Simulacrum. Let me know if I pronounced that correctly. 1 red for a 1/1 artifact creature goblin with haste. 3 in a red, sacrifice Sarpedian Simulacrum. It deals 4 damage to target creature. Solid creature, solid creature. So for 5 mana, you get to deal 4 damage to something. It's a haster, so on turn 1, you get to deal some damage. And it's an artifact for the aggressive artifact deck. I think this is going to be a high priority card to take in the red-black artifact decks, because it just kind of does everything you want. It's a cheap artifact that hits them, and then in the late game, you can cash this in to kill something. Sign me up. Sarpedian Simulacrum, solid red creature. I'm going to give this a C. Moving on, we have Siege Smash. 1 in a red for an instant with Split Second. Choose 1, destroy target artifact, or target creature gets +3/+2 and gains trample until end of turn. So, this card is fine. It's a fine combat trick, or it's a shatter effect. Shatter effects are just not always going to be great, but it also has that ability where you can give something +3/+2 and trample until end of turn. I think it's an okay combat trick. I'll give this a D. I don't give pluses, but this is a high D, probably like a D+. If you're playing against a deck with artifacts, obviously it goes up to like a C-level card. But yeah, I'll start things off with a high D here for Siege Smash. Moving on, we have Skittering Precursor. 2 in a red for an Eldrazi drone with the Void. This card has no color, but it's red. It's got Menace, so 3 mana for 3/3 Menace. Very, very solid, right? And when you sacrifice a non-token permanent, create a 0/1 colorless Eldrazi spawn creature token with sacrifice this creature, add a colorless mana. So you can't sacrifice spawns to make more spawns because that would be ridiculous. But if you look at it as just a 3 mana, 3/3 menace creature with the ability to occasionally make 0/1s. Now, where are you going to be able to do that? Well, it's going to be the red-black deck, right? In the red-black deck, with some occasional sacrificing here and there, I can see that with this in play, you can occasionally make an 0/1 Scion. Now, how good is that? Well, it gives you more fodder to sacrifice for, bone splinter type effects or anything like that. So it's okay. It's solid. But by itself, I'm mostly treating this as a 3 mana, 3/3 menace. And for that, I would give Skittering Precursor, particularly in this format, just a C. It's a high C. I would say it's just a C, and then I'll give it a high C if you can, sacrifice a few things here and there. Moving on, I did a kind of a double take when I saw this card. Skoa Embermage, 4 red for a 4/4 legendary. How many common legendaries do you see? 4 red for a 4/4 legendary creature, Goblin Wizard. Whenever Skoa Embermage enters the battlefield, it deals 4 damage to any target. Wow. Red has 2 commons that deal 4 damage to anything. So 5 might be the magic number. A 5 toughness creature, I think, is going to be very valuable in this format. Grandeur. Discard another card named Skoa Embermage, sacrifice 2 mountains, and Skoa deals 4 damage to any target. So if Skoa Embermage is in play, you have another one in your hand, you can discard it and sack 2 mountains to deal 4 damage to any target. Well, I mean, just by itself, this card is just really solid, right? 6 mana for a 4/4 ETB, kill anything? That's great, right? 6, I'm reading this correct, right? Now, like I said, the downside is you can't play multiple of these, right? You can't just have 5 Skoa Ember Mages. The cost of sacrificing 2 mountains is pretty high to deal 4 damage to something, but it's still something that you can do, and it's there just because if you draw multiple copies of this, it's probably too good. Also, this not being legendary might also be too good, but I think Skoa is really, really solid. I'm going to give this a C. I think this is just a very, very good card. I mean, maybe there's a world where this is a B-level card. I don't know. But I'm going to give this a C. Probably kind of a high C for Skoa Embermage. So Red's removal suite is looking very strong. Next, we have a Smelted Chargebug. 1 in a red for a 1/3 artifact creature that's an insect. It's got Menace. When Smelted Chargebug enters a battlefield, you get 2 energy. Whenever Smelted Chargebug attacks, you may pay 1 energy. If you do, another target creature gets +1/+0 and Menace until end of turn. You can't target itself, so it's not just a 2 mana 2/3 Menace, but it's a 2 mana 1/3 artifact, which is relevant for affinity. So it's got Menace, and it gives you 2 energy. So I think there's enough going on here. It's not absurd, but I think it's a nice role player. It's a solid 2-drop that you're going to be playing in most of your red decks because you're going to need the energy, or you're going to like the fact that it's an artifact. Maybe you don't want it in your red-green decks, but I'm going to give the Smelted Chargebug a C. Next, we have Spawn Gang Commander. This card is awesome. 3 red for a 2/2 creature. It's an Eldrazi Goblin. Whenever you cast this spell, create 3 0/1 colorless Eldrazi spawn creature tokens with sacrifice this creature, add colorless mana. 1 and a colorless. Sacrifice an Eldrazi. Spawn Gang Commander deals 2 damage to any target. I mean, this is kind of like Siege Gang Commander, right? That's kind of the joke. But if you want to use the spawn tokens to generate mana, you can do that, which is great. Now, they're not 1/1s, so you can't actually use them to have combat stats to trade with anything. So I don't know that it's necessarily better than Siege Gang Commander, but it's trying its best. Now, not having 3 power is a big deal, but remember, you can sack any Eldrazi. So not only you can sack itself, you can sack other Scions that you make. So I think this card is excellent. I am tempted to give this an A. I am very tempted to give this an A. You know what? I'm doing it. I was going to give it a high B, but I'm actually going to give this a low A. There's enough creature recursion in this format. Now, remember, there's another thing that you can do with this card, which I think takes it up a level. Oftentimes with Siege Gang Commander, you play it for 5 mana. You play it for 5 mana, you're not going to have mana to sacrifice, right? But with the Spawn Gang Commander, you play it for 5. Let's say they attack with 3 things. You can block all 3 creatures, Or you can block two creatures, sack 2 of them for mana, then you can fling the other one to deal 2 damage to something. Now, you don't necessarily always want to be able to do that, but you have that as an option, which I think is really, really strong. This card is excellent. It's going to help you even when you're behind. I'm going to give this a low A. Moving on, we have Thriving Skyclaw. 2 red for a 3/2 flying cat dragon. Whenever Thriving Skyclaw enters the battlefield, you get 3 energy. So 4 mana for a 3/2 flyer that gives you 3 energy is already very solid. When Thriving Skyclaw attacks, you may pay 3 energy. If you do, put a +1/+1 counter on it. That might not necessarily be the best way to utilize the 3 energy, but at least it gives you a built-in way to use energy. What that means is you play this on turn 4 and you attack on turn 5, boom, you're paying 4 mana for a 4/3 flyer, which isn't terrible. And if you have other things to do with the energy, that's also really solid. We'll note that it costs double red, which is a little unfortunate, which does take away from the power a little bit, but I will give Thriving Skyclaw a C level card. Pretty solid. Next, we have Unstable Amulet. 1 and a red for an artifact. Whenever Unstable Amulet enters the battlefield, you get 2 energy. Whenever you cast a spell from anywhere other than your hand, Unstable Amulet deals 1 damage to each opponent. We've already seen in this format multiple ways to cast spells from exile, so it won't just count itself because it has tap. Pay 2 energy. Exile the top card of your library. You may play it until you exile another card with Unstable Amulet. What does that mean? It basically just means pay 2 energy, draw a card. However, let's say you exile like a 9-drop and you can't play it. Well, then you can use this again if you have more energy. And then anytime you do cast a spell from exile, if you play a land, you don't deal damage. But if you cast a spell, it deals 1 damage. So at the very least, this is a 2-mana artifact that does basically draw you a card, right? You might not be able to play it right away, but it's better than the other impulsive effects where you can only cast it till your next turn. This is better than that. It's worse than draw a card, but better than those effects where you have to cast the card immediately. So, I think it's pretty solid. If you have ways to create energy, obviously this is nice because then all of a sudden you get to convert your energy into cards. So I think it's pretty solid, and it replaces itself, and it's an artifact for affinity. So I'll give Unstable Amulet a C, but maybe there's going to be some kind of control energy deck where you can extract more value out of this card, and I can see a world where Unstable Amulet can go up to a B level card, but C for now. Moving on, we have Void Pouncer, 1 and a red for a 3/1 Eldrazi. It's got a kicker cost of 2 and a colorless. If Void Pouncer was kicked, it enters the battlefield with 2 +1/+1 counters and a trample counter on it with haste. So, it's a 2-mana 3/1. Not very good, right? 2-mana 3/1 is that's a D level, filler level card. However, if you are the Eldrazi deck, for 5 mana, so you have something you can play on turn 3, turn 2 as a curve beatdown card, but on turn 5, this is a 5/3 trample haste. It's not bad. It's not insane. I mean, 3 toughness is, it's kind of on the low end. But I think if you're in Eldrazi deck, you're certainly going to be reasonably happy playing with this card. If you're not, I don't think you want this card very much in your deck. But if you can play this for the colorless cost, I will give Void Pouncer a C. Moving on. The final card. We have Wheel of Potential. 2 and a red for a sorcery. You get 3 energy. Then you may pay X energy. Each player may exile their hand and draw X cards. If X is 7 or more, you may play cards you owned exiled this way until the end of your next turn. This is kind of a way to basically cast a Wheel of Fortune, but also keep some of the cards that you exiled at least and be able to play them until the end of your next turn. But I normally just hate effects like this in general. Symmetrical effects, Wheel of Fortune effects, Time Twister effects are just not something that's good in traditional limited Magic. If you have Cube with Orcish Bowmasters and Shieldred, sure, but in normal Magic, this is just not a card that you ever want to put into your deck. I will give Wheel of Potential an F. There is no potential for this card. All right. Now time to go over the top 5 commons, and this was very, very difficult for me, so I will list you the honorable mentions as well, because there's a lot of build-aroundy type cards where in certain instances, you're going to want to take some of these cards over some of the top 5 cards that we listed, but let's take a look at the top 5 red commons. Alrighty, so starting things off with the honorable mention here is the Void Pouncer. Now, again, this is a card that I think is very, very solid if you are kind of an Eldrazi deck, if you have lots of ways to generate colorless mana, then, like I said, having that flexibility of being a 2-mana 3/1 and also being a 5-mana 5/3 trample haster, this card could certainly be an overperformer, and I could be sleeping on this card, but I did want to mention it just so I get to cover my bases. But I think in an Eldrazi deck, I can see the case being made to take this over some of the cards that you'll see coming up here. Moving on, we have number 5, Sarpedian Simulacrum. 1 red for a 1/1 haste. 3 in a red, Sarpedian Simulacrum deals 4 damage to target creature. Now, this is a card that's specifically going to be very good in the artifact deck with affinity, because this is just a cheap artifact that deals damage. In other decks, it's a fine removal effect, but specifically in the artifact deck, that's where I think you could see this card move up a couple of tiers, depending. Next, we have Thriving Skyclaw, 4 mana, 3/2 flyer. The thing with this card is, even if you're playing a deck that's not looking for energy specifically, this is just this has a way to devour the energy by itself, which is why I kind of have it once a little bit higher than the Simulacrum. It's the Simulacrum, it could be close between the two, but the fact that for this one, even if you're not an energy deck, if you're just looking to beat down, you can always just play this card in your deck and have it be a 4 mana 4/3 flyer, is the reason why I have Thriving Skyclaw at number 4. Coming in at number 3, we have Skoa Embermage. 6 mana for a 4/4 that enters a battlefield and deals 4 damage or something is just really, really strong, right? I just feel like that's a really solid common. It feels like an uncommon, honestly. It's like, did they mess up? Like, is this supposed to be an uncommon? I don't know. That's what it feels like. So you know, maybe because it's a common I have it low? I don't even know. This card just confuses me. Anyways, I'm going to have it here at number 3 because it costs 6 mana and because the other 2 removal spells are just really, really efficient. But I do think this is a high pick, and red looks really solid. Like, I love Skoa Embermage, right? But you know what I like more than Skoa Embermage? For now, Fanged Flames. 1 in a red, 4 damage. Unconditional, exile. So you get to, you know, there's some recursion elements in this format, and this prevents that from happening. 2 mana for 4 damage is just a really, really great deal. But the best common in the set, I feel, is Galvanic Discharge, or at least the best red common. I mean, this card is just, you almost never see this. 1 mana instant, you can deal 3 damage to anything, potentially more if you have more energy, and if you kill something smaller, right, you have energy left over. For 1 mana, this just does so much. I just think this is amazing, and certainly a card that you can even consider splashing in an energy-heavy deck that, you know, could splash red. This card is just that good. I just think this card is really, really solid and is going to be a contender for best common in the set. All right, well, that'll do it here for the red cards. Red looks pretty strong, at least at common. It looks pretty deep. It's proactive, which I like, especially early on. I kind of want to try out the more proactive archetypes just to see if that's the thing that you can do, particularly because, you know, there are archetypes that's looking to go long. But red certainly has a lot of aggressive elements to it, along with just a bunch of awesome removals. I mean, removal spells. The top 3 commons for me are all removal spells, right? Let's see if black can stack up to it, because black usually has the best removal. But we're talking about a lightning bolt at common, a lava coil at common, and a 6 mana 4/4 that deals 4 damage to something, to anything, by the way. You can go to the face at common as well. So red looks really, really well positioned so far in our color rankings. Anyways, thank you so much for watching. I really do appreciate it. Feel free to hit the like or subscribe button for more daily videos just like this. If you've enjoyed the content and wanted to support the channel in another way, I do have a Patreon. The link is in the description below. Additionally, if you want to look back at this and just look at what I rated all of the cards in this video and maybe previous videos, the link to my red card rankings is also in the description below if you wanted to check it out. Like I said before, once I'm done with all of the set reviews, I will have a master sheet with all the card rankings for you to look at when you start your first online draft and want to have a good sense to start out with in terms of the overall power level of all the cards that you see in your packs. Thank you for watching, and we are going to be tackling black in the next video. I'll catch you tomorrow.